The twilight hours always held a special kind of peace for Eleanor. Her cottage, nestled at the edge of the old woods, was a sanctuary built over decades of a well-lived life. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves against the window pane, every scent of aged wood and blooming jasmine was a familiar comfort. She was 72, a retired history professor whose mind remained as sharp and incisive as ever, though her body carried the gentle weariness of time. Her husband, Thomas, had passed a decade ago, leaving behind a legacy of love, laughter, and a meticulously curated library that Eleanor still lovingly tended. This house wasn't just bricks and mortar, it was a living testament to their shared history, a fortress of memories. That evening, as the last sliver of orange faded from the sky, Eleanor was settled in her favorite armchair, a cup of chamomile tea steaming beside her, a worn copy of The Odyssey open on her lap. The silence of the house was usually a balm, but tonight it felt different. A subtle shift in the air, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck. She dismissed it as an old woman's fancy, a trick of the deepening shadows. Yet the feeling persisted, a faint dissonance in the symphony of the night. Then came the sound, a faint scraping, barely audible above the chirping crickets, from the direction of the back door. Eleanor's hand tightened on her book. It wasn't the sound of a stray animal. It was deliberate, cautious. Her heart, usually so steady, gave a small, nervous flutter. She closed her book, placing it carefully on the side table. Her gaze swept around the familiar room, every object a silent witness to her sudden unease. The scraping grew bolder, accompanied by a soft thud, then a muffled whisper. There were people outside, not friends, not neighbors. The kind of people who moved in the shadows, whose presence brought with it a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling night air. Fear, cold and sharp, coiled in her stomach. But beneath it, something else stirred, a fierce, primal protectiveness of her home, her sanctuary, her memories. This house had seen her through joy and sorrow. It would not fall prey to intruders. She rose slowly, deliberately, her movements belying the frantic beat of her heart. Every step on the old floorboards was a test of her resolve. She approached the kitchen, the back door now clearly the source of the disturbance. Through the frosted glass panel, she could make out two shadowy figures, young, agile, attempting to jimmy the lock. Boys, really, judging by their lean frames and tentative movements. Desperate, perhaps, but desperation, Eleanor knew from her studies of history, could be a dangerous catalyst.
Her mind raced, sifting through options. Call the police? By the time they arrived, these boys could be inside, wreaking havoc. Yell? That might startle them, but also escalate the situation, potentially turning a break-in into something far more violent. No, shouting was not her style. Eleanor had always preferred strategy over brute force, intellect over instinctual reaction. A plan began to form, audacious and risky, but distinctly hers. She reached the back door, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of the handle. The lock was straining, groaning under their efforts. She could hear their hushed, urgent voices now, a mixture of bravado and nervous energy. "Almost got it, man," one whispered. "Hurry up before someone sees us," replied the other, his voice cracking slightly. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Eleanor did the unthinkable. She didn't call for help. She didn't scream. She unlatched the lock herself. The sound of the latch clicking open was surprisingly loud in the tense silence. The figures outside froze. Their tools clattered to the ground. Slowly, deliberately, Eleanor pulled the door open. The porch light, a warm yellow glow, illuminated their faces. Two young men, barely out of their teens, their eyes wide with shock and a fleeting flicker of fear. One held a crowbar, the other a screwdriver. Their clothes were dark, their faces smudged. They looked utterly bewildered, caught in the sudden glare, their carefully constructed anonymity shattered. Eleanor met their gaze, her expression unreadable. Her voice, when it came, was calm, almost soothing, devoid of any panic or accusation. "Pettoresho, amicia barci. Come in, I'm making tea." Her words hung in the air, an absurd, surreal invitation to two would-be robbers. The crowbar slipped from the hand of the taller boy, landing with a soft thud on the porch. The smaller one stared, his mouth slightly agape. Their initial shock slowly morphed into confusion, then a hesitant curiosity. They exchanged glances, unsure how to react to this elderly woman who, instead of screaming, was offering them hospitality. Eleanor stepped back, gesturing into the warmth of her kitchen.
"It's a chilly night," she added, her voice still gentle. "You must be cold." They shuffled inside, their movements awkward and uncertain, like wild animals coaxed into a cage. The contrast between their dark, menacing presence and the cozy, orderly kitchen was stark. Eleanor watched them, observing every tremor in their hands, every dart of their eyes. They were boys, yes, but dangerous ones, pushed to a desperate act. She had to maintain control.
"Sit," she instructed, pointing to the sturdy wooden table in the center of the kitchen. They hesitated, then slowly lowered themselves onto the chairs, their eyes still scanning the room, searching for a hidden trap, a trick. Eleanor moved with unhurried grace to the stove, where a kettle was already simmering. She had put it on earlier, a part of her nightly ritual, a fortunate coincidence that now played perfectly into her unexpected plan. "Sugar? Milk?" she asked, her back to them as she reached for the teacups. She could feel their eyes on her, their minds undoubtedly reeling. What was this old woman doing? Was she mad? Was she setting them up? This uncertainty, she knew, was her greatest weapon. It disarmed them more effectively than any weapon she could wield. No, thank you," the taller boy, who introduced himself as Raj, stammered. The smaller one, Akash, merely shook his head, his gaze fixed on the antique grandfather clock in the corner, its rhythmic ticking a stark counterpoint to the racing beat of their hearts. Eleanor poured the steaming tea into 3 delicate porcelain cups, the clinking of china sounding unnervingly normal. She placed a cup in front of each of them, along with a plate of homemade biscuits. The aroma of brewing tea and warm spices filled the kitchen, a stark contrast to the cold fear that had gripped them moments before. "Eat," she encouraged, pushing the plate closer. "You look like you haven't had a decent meal in days." Raj and Akash looked at the tea, then at the biscuits, then back at Eleanor. Suspicion warred with hunger in their eyes. Eleanor took a sip of her own tea, her expression serene. "It's a special blend," she said, her eyes twinkling slightly. "Helps clear the mind." She wasn't lying. It was indeed a special blend, one that had often helped her clear her own mind during moments of great stress. And tonight, she needed all the clarity she could get. As they cautiously sipped their tea, the initial tension in the room began to dissipate, replaced by a strange, almost uncomfortable normalcy. Eleanor began to speak, her voice soft, weaving a narrative that was both disarming and subtly probing. She didn't ask them why they were there. She knew. Instead, she spoke of the house, of Thomas, of the history embedded in its walls. She spoke of the changing times, the struggles young people faced, the desperation that could drive good people to bad choices. "My husband, Thomas, he was a kind man," she reminisced, gazing into her teacup. "He always believed in second chances, even for those who seemed beyond redemption. He used to say that every person has a story, and if you listen closely enough, you might find the reason behind their actions." Raj and Akash listened, their initial wariness slowly giving way to a grudging fascination. They were not accustomed to being spoken to in such a manner, not as criminals, but as human beings with stories. Eleanor watched them, reading their body language, the subtle shifts in their expressions. Raj, the taller one, seemed to be the leader, more outwardly defiant, but with a hidden vulnerability. Akash, younger and quieter, seemed genuinely uncomfortable, his gaze often drifting to the floor. "This house," Eleanor continued, her voice gaining a touch of steel, "is not just a house. It's a repository of a lifetime. Every book, every photograph, every piece of furniture holds a memory. To violate it would be to violate a soul." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. "And I, gentlemen, am its guardian." Raj shifted uncomfortably. "Look, ma'am," he began, his voice rough. "We didn't mean any harm. We just needed some money." Eleanor nodded slowly. "I understand desperation, young man. I've seen it in the pages of history, and I felt its cold grip myself. But desperation doesn't justify destruction. It doesn't justify terrorizing an old woman in her home." Her gaze was direct, unwavering. "What would your mother say?" The question hit Akash like a physical blow. He flinched, his head dropping. Raj's jaw tightened, a flicker of shame crossing his face. Eleanor pressed on, not with anger, but with a quiet, persistent conviction. "You see that painting there?" She pointed to a landscape hanging above the fireplace. "Thomas painted that. He wasn't a professional, but he poured his heart into it. If you at Bourbriand, you might have smashed it, thinking it was worthless. But to me, it's priceless. Just as your lives, young men, are priceless, worth more than whatever paltry sum you hope to steal from my home."
The psychological warfare was subtle, relentless. She wasn't threatening them with jail. She was threatening them with their own consciences, with the weight of their potential actions. She saw the cracks forming in their hardened exteriors. They were not hardened criminals. They were misguided youths, perhaps hungry, certainly desperate, but not entirely devoid of humanity. "I know what you came for," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "and I understand why. But there are other ways that don't involve shattering the peace of an old woman, ways that don't involve throwing away your own futures." She took another sip of tea, her eyes never leaving them. This was the moment. The tea had done its work, not by drugging them, but by disarming their defenses, by forcing them to confront their own humanity. Now for the trap, a trap she had meticulously prepared for years, ever since the increasing crime rates in the area had prompted her to take precautions. She had a state-of-the-art security system discreetly installed, with hidden cameras and a silent panic button disguised as a benign household item.
As she spoke of their futures, Eleanor's right hand subtly moved towards the antique silver sugar bowl on the table. It looked innocent, a mere serving piece, but beneath its ornate lid, a tiny, almost invisible button was nestled. This was her failsafe, her ultimate recourse. "So," she concluded, her voice firm, "you have a choice. You can leave now without touching anything, and I will consider this a misunderstanding. Or you can proceed with your intentions and face the consequences." Her fingers brushed the sugar bowl, her thumb finding the small, cool button. A silent signal, a discreet transmission, was sent directly to the local police station, accompanied by a live feed from the hidden cameras in her kitchen. Raj and Akash looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. The initial bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by a deep unease. They had walked into a situation they couldn't comprehend, a psychological maze designed by a seemingly frail old woman who was anything but. The tea, the biscuits, the calm demeanor, it had all been a performance, a masterful deception. We should go," Akash mumbled, his voice barely audible. Raj hesitated, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape, a way to regain control. But there was none. Eleanor's gaze held him captive. She had stripped them of their anonymity, their aggression, their very purpose. Just then, a faint siren wailed in the distance, growing steadily louder. Raj's head snapped up, his eyes widening in panic. Akash gasped, pushing his chair back with a scrape. They scrambled to their feet, their brief moment of civility shattered. You called the cops?" Raj stammered, his voice laced with betrayal. Eleanor merely smiled, a knowing, almost pitying smile. "I told you, young men, this house is my fortress, and I am its guardian. Did you truly think I would leave it unprotected?" She took another slow sip of her tea, the warmth spreading through her, a stark contrast to the cold fear now gripping her unexpected guests. The sirens screamed to a halt outside. Flashing blue and red lights painted the windows. Heavy footsteps thudded on the porch. "Police, open up!" a voice boomed from outside. Raj and Akash were trapped, caught in the web Eleanor had so calmly, so meticulously woven. Eleanor rose, her movements still graceful, her composure absolute. She walked to the back door, past the frozen figures of the boys, and opened it to reveal two uniformed officers, their faces grim, their hands on their holsters. She stepped aside, gesturing towards the two stunned young men. "These gentlemen," she said, her voice clear and calm, "were just leaving, after enjoying some tea, of course." The officers, initially bewildered by the scene, a cozy kitchen, an elderly woman, two wide-eyed young men, and a plate of half-eaten biscuits, quickly assessed the situation. They saw the crowbar and screwdriver on the porch, the signs of forced entry. They saw the terror in the boys' eyes. Raj and Akash offered no resistance. They were too stunned, too defeated, too utterly outmaneuvered to fight. They had walked into an old woman's home to steal, and instead, they had been served a bitter cup of justice. As the police led the boys away, their heads bowed in shame, Eleanor stood at her doorway, watching the flashing lights recede into the night. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not one of unease, but of profound peace. Her home was safe. Her sanctuary remained intact. And Eleanor, the retired professor, had proven that wisdom, courage, and a calm demeanor could be far more potent than any weapon. She walked back into her kitchen, a faint smile playing on her lips. The tea was still warm. She poured herself another cup, the taste of victory sweet and satisfying.